Before there were pyramids, before the gods were etched in stone, there was mud and blood, and the slow rising breath of a nation yet unnamed. The land we now call Egypt was once a fractured spine of rival clans and chieftains, its people carved their stories into the banks of the Nile, not yet certain what future they flowed toward. There were two lands, upper, ruled by the lords of the southern deserts, and lower, governed by the fertile marshes of the delta. Two lands, two crowns, and between them, centuries of longing for unity, for order, for the dream of something greater than tribe or war. Out of this primeval swirl of chaos and clay stepped a figure wrapped in shadow and legend, a man known to some as Menes, to others as Narmer. His name comes to us on broken palettes and faded ink, written not with certainty but with reverence. He was a warlord, perhaps, a priest-king, a founder, a flame lit at the dawn of civilization. What does it take to forge a kingdom from dust? To become the first Pharaoh when there was no word yet for Pharaoh? This is not the tale of a god, but of a man who would become one in the memory of a people who needed him to be more than mortal. Join us as we travel back to the beginning, not just of a man, but of a world. And if you find yourself breathing, slower eyes growing heavier, that's all right. History, like the Nile, flows best when you let go and drift. Before there were kings, there were floods. Each year, the Nile swelled and spilled its dark waters across the valley floor, churning silt into gold. In the south, where the river coiled like a cobra through high cliffs and barren hills, the people waited, watched, prayed. They knew the river's moods like they knew each other's faces, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, but always sacred. In one of these southern valleys, far from the tangled reeds of the delta, a child was born to a chief's household. His name was lost to the dust, but the name he earned would endure, Narmer or Menes. Some said the two were one and the same. Others whispered that Menes was a title, not a man, the he who endures. But to his people, he was flesh and voice. He was the son of a land that had waited centuries for someone to rise. He grew in a time of war, though it wasn't always called that. Raids were common, borders were fluid. The notion of Egypt was still a dream, flickering behind the eyes of poets and shamans. Young Narmer trained with obsidian-tipped spears, his feet hardened by sun-baked stone, his hands calloused by ropes and leather. He learned the songs of the south, not songs of peace, but of thunder and pride. By adolescence, he had already stood beside his father in parley with rival tribes. He had seen men lie with smiles and bleed without sound. He understood that power was not given, it was seized. And he listened to the old ones, to the river, to the stories carved into cave walls. In every tale, one truth returned, like the flood. Two lands could not remain divided forever, from a ridge overlooking the plains. Narmer would sometimes sit alone and stare northward. The wind carried the scent of unfamiliar crops. The sky stretched wider. He wondered what lay beyond the narrowing bend of the river. What peoples, what gods, what fears, and he wondered not for the last time whether it would be him who would crossed that threshold first, or one of his enemies. The unification of Egypt did not begin with a battle. It began with a marriage. Narmer, now a man of stature among his people, took as wife a noblewoman of the northern delta. It was a political arrangement, as many were, but more than that, it was a signal. A quiet gesture of ambition, whispers, began. Could the South and North truly be joined? Would the red crown and the white crown ever rest upon one brow? Not everyone welcomed the idea. Some chieftains scoffed, others plotted. Skirmishes flared along the riverbanks. Villages were razed. And in the firelight of these brutal nights, Narmer forged his resolve. He would not be another warlord in a long line of forgotten names. He would be the last of the many and the first of the one. And so he prepared not only his warriors, but his scribes, his artisans, his priests. For Narmer understood what many conquerors forget. Power is memory. If he could shape the story, he could shape the world. In the sacred city of Hierakonpolis, the high priests anointed him with oil. They painted falcons on his shields. They called him chosen of Horus, not yet divine, but close enough. The people gathered in silence as he stepped forward beneath the banners of the South. A hawk's cry echoed above. Dust swirled like incense. The river watched and remembered. For in that moment, beneath the southern sun, a man was no longer a chief. He was a vision, a beginning, a crown waiting to be claimed. It was not on parchment or papyrus that Narmer first wrote his legacy. It was stone. Somewhere between conquest and ceremony, the Narmer palette was carved a thick slab of siltstone, etched on both sides with symbols older than language. It does not speak, it shows. And what it shows is war. On one side, Narmer strides forward, towering above his enemies. Wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, one arm raised, mace in hand, ready to strike a kneeling foe. Behind him, a sandal bearer follows, barefoot upon sacred ground. Ahead of him, chaos is subdued, his will made flesh. On the reverse, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, parading among rows of decapitated enemies, their heads counted beneath falcon banners. Two beasts with interlocking necks, strange, mythical, snarl at each other in perfect balance, tethered by Narmer's hands. This was not a record, it was a proclamation. Narmer had done what none before him could. He had broken the spine of resistance in the Delta. Whether by blade or bond, he had taken the red land and merged it with the white. Two crowns, one ruler, one land, Kemet, the Black Land. But unification was not peace. Victory brought with it the burden of vision. He could not simply conquer, he had to shape. And to shape, he had to convince. That meant more than spears. It meant symbols, myths, rituals. The Narmer palette was one such symbol. It told the story that people would whisper in the temples and teach to their children. It told them the two lands were always meant to be one, and Narmer was always meant to rule. But not all believed. In the northern marshes, resistance simmered. Former rulers of the Delta, proud in their isolation, suspicious of southern law, refused to bow. Raids flared like sparks along the frontier. Narmer responded not only with soldiers, but with infrastructure. He built canals to flood rebel villages. He dispatched emissaries who bore gifts in one hand and threats in the other. And slowly, the resistance was choked, not just by war, but by inevitability. He did not rule alone. A council of elders, priests, and governors helped administer the growing kingdom. Yet Narmer's will pulsed through them all. He demanded standardization of grain measures, of building codes, of the language itself. The gods were summoned into unity too. Where once Horus and Set warred across pantheons, now they stood side by side in his court at the confluence of culture and ambition. Narmer founded a new city, in Ebij, the White Walls. Later, it would be called Memphis. It was no mere capital. It was a hinge, positioned between Upper and Lower Egypt. It became a symbol of balance, of the stitched seam that held the kingdom together. And here, in Memphis, the transformation truly began. Narmer no longer appeared in public as a mere man. He was draped in symbols, the jewel crown, the flail and crook, the false beard, the kilt of gods. He sat beneath awnings perfumed with myrrh. Dancers sang his praises in the language of birds. The scribes called him not Narmer, but Nisitbiti, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, a living god, but in private. He remained watchful. He knew that order, once made, must be guarded, or it would slip, like wet clay, back into formlessness. He walked the walls of Memphis at dawn, accompanied only by silence. He consulted with astrologers, farmers, generals, and stonemasons. He was not yet the timeless Pharaoh of later tales. He was still building the stage from which such myths could rise. And the Nile, ever patient, ever listening, continued to swell and recede. Crops flourished. Trade routes opened. Gold flowed from Nubia. Cedar came down from Lebanon. Narmer's Egypt was no longer just a river. It was a current of ambition, sweeping all who lived along its banks towards something grander than memory. The palette would remain, buried for millennia, until unearthed by modern hands in the dry soil of Hierakonpolis. And though no voice from Narmer's time would echo forward, the stone speaks still that it says, "This was the beginning." Power, once claimed, must be worn not as a garland, but as a crown of thorns. For Narmer, the unification of Egypt was not a moment, but a process, a daily act of maintenance, negotiation, and sacrifice. The palette may have captured a victory, but it did not portray the long, delicate labor of ruling that would come after the parades, long after the blood on the battlefield had dried into myth. In the newly unified kingdom, old loyalties died slowly. The north, still raw from conquest, eyed the southern court with skepticism. Petty kings had lost their thrones, their temples, their gods. In their place stood Narmer, regal, distant, relentless. But to some, he was still an outsider in red soil, a southerner seated upon a northern dream. There were whispers, a priesthood in Buto that refused to pronounce his name during prayers, a merchant guild that slowed its deliveries from the delta ports. Small things, petty defiance. But Narmer heard them all, and he understood. Victory does not erase memory, it must replace it. So he worked with symbols. He ordered temples constructed. In the north, that honored both Horus and Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. He appointed local governors, not from the south, but from the delta itself, and he decreed that the double crown, Pishant, be worn in all public ceremonies. Not the white crown, not the red. Both, always both. Yet even this diplomacy carried weight. Every new law, every edict, every symbolic gesture pressed heavier upon his shoulders. The scribes began to draw him larger in reliefs, towering over enemies, over priests, even gods. But these were dreams, not truths. The man beneath the paint still bled when cut, still lay awake at night, watching moonlight crawl across limestone ceilings. He missed his mother in those moments. The smell of oil on her hands, the lilt of her voice in the old tongue. In Memphis, surrounded by servants and guards, Narmer was lonelier than he had ever been among the sandstone cliffs of his youth. Power isolated, and isolation bred fear, not of his enemies, but of what he might become to his people. Still, he endured. He launched expeditions southward, into the lands of Nubia, securing gold mines and ivory routes. He built a new granary near the Fayum basin, ordering canals to be dug by the thousands. He sent emissaries to the eastern deserts, reaching as far as Sinai, where copper and turquoise glittered beneath barren hills. Each conquest was not for glory, but for permanence. A kingdom cannot stand on myth alone. It needs stone, grain, trade, and Narmer built them all. Quietly, methodically, like a mason preparing a tomb, not for a king, but for a civilization. But even as Egypt flourished, danger never drifted far. There was an uprising near the northern coast, led by a former chieftain's son, born of Delta blood, convinced that Narmer's rule was temporary, that the gods would return the crown to the marsh. The rebels seized a key port, blocking cedar shipments and threatening trade. Narmer acted swiftly. He gathered his elite guard, known as the Falcon Standard, and marched north. No sweeping campaign, no songs, just cold, precise retribution. The port fell within days. The ringleaders were bound in reeds and displayed in Memphis, not to mock them, but to remind the people, rebellion ends where unity begins. Yet something shifted in Narmer. After that, his gaze grew heavier. His public appearances became rarer. Some said he had been cursed by the northern priests. Others claimed he simply began to see the cost of his own legend. Whatever the reason, his face, once carved with youthful fire, now appeared aged in the limestone, not weakened, but tempered. He began preparing a tomb, not one hastily assembled in his final days, but a structure begun while he still ruled, deep in the sacred necropolis of Abydos. It would be vast, surrounded by offerings, marked with ivory tags and clay seals. It was not a monument to himself, but to the world he had helped birth. A tomb not for a king, but for a founder. He knew his end would come, as it had for all those before him. But he also knew this: no matter the whispers, the rebellions, or the doubts, the land had changed. The Nile no longer belonged to many. It flowed for one, and in that flow, Narmer had etched something that would outlive him. Not a reign, a beginning. The sun over Abydos never blinked. It rose each day across the cliffs and sands, casting long shadows over the tombs of kings and dreamers. Here, among the rock-cut sepulchres and sacred enclosures, Narmer laid the foundation of his final resting place, not in secret, not in sorrow, but with intention. For Narmer understood what most kings forget, that death is not an ending, but a mirror. A tomb is not for the dead, but for the living who will come to remember. His tomb, nestled among the rising cult of Osiris, was simple in its architecture, but profound in meaning. Rectangular, low, carved in quiet dignity. Within, small chambers held offerings, food, incense, tools, tokens of a world he had unified. Ivory labels, marked with pictographs, were placed like seeds, each one whispering a name, a deed. a fragment of the dream. The workers who built it were not slaves, but craftsmen, artisans, stonemasons, loyal to the house of the falcon. They spoke softly in the desert heat, their hands stained with ochre and ash. Some carved prayers into the walls when no one watched. Others simply wept. Outside the tomb, the temple rose. This was the beating heart, not of Narmer's ego, but of his faith. The house of Horus, a place where the divine met the dust, where the Pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but the living tether between sky and soil. Priests tended the altars. Young initiates memorized hymns by firelight. Offerings were laid out on alabaster trays, beside jars sealed with twisted reeds. The scent of lotus and resin wafted into the wind. And in the center, beneath a painted canopy, stood a statue, Narmer as Horus, falcon-eyed. Eternal dot, he had become what he had once only. Worn, not a god, but a symbol of divine order. Marot, in a world that had once known only fracture. The people came. From the north, from the south, from villages so far they had never known a single king. They brought fish, wine, woven cloth. They touched the walls and whispered his names. Not just Narmer, not just Menes, but Unifier, Endurer. He who wears both crowns. They believed, now, not just in him, but in the idea he had carved from the chaos, that Egypt could be one, that the Nile could flow beneath a single sky, watched by a single sun, ruled by a single voice. In Memphis, life continued. Markets bustled with goods from Nubia and Byblus. Temples rang with bronze bells and the thump of sacred drums. Children born under Narmer's rule had never known division. For them, the idea of two Egypts was just that, an idea distant, like a dream told by old men at dusk. And yet Narmer himself never stopped walking the thin edge between past and future. He knew the tides of time. He had seen chiefs fall and kingdoms collapse into sand. He had studied the bones of failed dynasties carved into cliff walls, their names erased by wind and envy. He knew unity was not guaranteed. It had to be reborn with each generation. So he focused on the temples, not just as places of worship, but as archives, as anchors. Scribes recorded births, deaths, grain harvests, lunar cycles. They carved calendars onto stone. They aligned pylons. With stars, they invented permanence, not because Narmer demanded it, but because he understood that memory was power. And so, the temples thrived, not merely in Memphis, but in Nechanus, in Phinis, in Buto, even among those who once resisted him. The gods walked beside each other now. Horus and Wadjet, Set and Neith, once rivals, now woven into the same tapestry. Under Narmer, Egypt was not made smaller by unification. It grew richer, stranger, more complex. He allowed contradiction. He made room for difference, but always within the frame of order. He knew he would die. He did not fear it, for the tomb was ready. The temple stood, the scribes wrote, the people prayed, and the Nile flowed, not away from him, but toward the future he had shaped. One river, one kingdom, one dream. And in the stillness of that desert heat, where wind whispered through stone and vultures circled above, Narmer stood beside the walls of his tomb and smiled, not because he believed he would be remembered, but because he had made remembering possible. Memphis woke before the sun. Fishermen cast nets by starlight. Bakers stoked clay ovens with dry palm fronds. Priests traced stars across the fading sky, watching for signs. And in the palace, a modest structure by later standards, but noble. In its geometry, Narmer sat in silence, gazing eastward. He no longer sought glory. He sought continuity. The House of Two Lands, as the crown was now called, was not merely a symbol of conquest. It was a living institution, a fragile agreement dressed in gold and ritual. Every day it survived was a victory, and every day it faced the threat of unraveling. Narmer's ministers brought news as sunrise bled across the horizon. Cattle sick in the delta, bandits along the eastern trail, a dispute between priests of Thoth and scribes of Seshat over calendar dates, small things, yet each held the potential to fissure the whole. A kingdom is not held by swords, but by 1,000 invisible threads: tradition, language, water, belief. Narmer ruled by maintaining those threads. He sat with merchants and masons. He listened to the keepers of bees and the shepherds of desert goats. He mediated temple disputes with a patience that confused his warriors. His reign was no longer about expansion. It was about balance. In the court, there were rules. No voice spoke above his own unless he asked it to. No sandals touched the dais where he sat. Children were taught his story before they learned their letters. But Narmer did not rule with cruelty. He ruled with weight, with the awareness that he was the hinge of something vast and ancient, and still terribly young. There were days he spent entirely alone, walking the edge of the Nile at twilight. He watched the ibis pick through reeds, watched crocodiles laze. In muddy shallows, their stillness as complete as stone. He thought of his father, now silent in the grave fields of the south, of his mother's hands, painting charms with crushed lapis, of his own son, growing in the shadow of a crown too heavy for innocence. What would the boy inherit? Not gold, not war, but the burden of order. Narmer taught him the rituals himself, not with tenderness, but with care. He showed him how to wear the crown, how to speak the names of gods without trembling, how to choose silence over rage. He made the child sit through council disputes and temple feasts. He let him see what rule cost, but he also let him laugh. On feast days, when drums echoed through the white-walled city, Narmer walked among his people. He let them touch his robe, his hands. He ate dates from farmers' baskets, drank beer from clay jugs pressed into his grip by trembling fingers. And sometimes, when no one was looking, he laughed with his son beneath the sycamore trees, tossing pebbles at ducks and watching them scatter like soldiers. He was, above all, human. But the image, the role, required more. The Pharaoh was not only king, he was Nesubiti, the dual being, divine and mortal, falcon and man. The priests reminded him, gently but often, that his face was no longer his own. It belonged to the nation now, to the gods, to the stone carvings that would outlast him. He accepted this, but never surrendered to it. When foreign envoys came, bearing tribute from lands beyond the Sinai, turquoise, incense, strange scripts, on painted scrolls, Narmer welcomed them with solemnity. But in his eyes there burned something else, curiosity. What lay beyond these maps? What river ran beyond the Nile? He knew his kingdom was vast, but he also knew it was not infinite. And that was the point. The House of Two Lands was not heaven. It was not perfect, but it was real. It was built from mud and ash and will, and it was his to protect. So he returned to his throne. listened to the scribes, the farmers, the fears of old priests who warned of drought and omen. He watched the sun rise and fall across Memphis, knowing that his face would one day fade, but that the structure he built, the way it made people live, speak, pray, would echo in the tombs of later kings. He would be honored as a predecessor, a shadow behind the crown. But in his lifetime, Narmer needed no statues. His monument was the land itself, sewn together by story and sacrifice. He had made Egypt, and it was beginning to believe in itself. The Nile does not rush. It remembers, and in the slow meandering of its waters, Narmer began to understand that eternity is not found in years, but in systems. He was no longer young. The fire that had once burned in his stride was now a steady ember behind his gaze. But the old king had one more ambition: not to conquer, not to be praised, but to make Egypt last. He turned, now not to soldiers, but to scribes, writing the sacred tool of permanence, not the hurried scratches of a market tally, but the precise, divine strokes of hieroglyphs. Each symbol a word, each word a breath, each breath a way of keeping something from being lost. Under Narmer's guidance, the writing system became the mortar between generations. Tax records, temple hymns, law codes, harvest logs, all inscribed on clay tags, bone plaques, and eventually papyrus. He ordered the formation of scribe schools, first in Memphis, then in Abydos and Hierakonpolis. Young boys, narrow-eyed and patient, learned to turn reeds into meaning. To them, he entrusted the memory of the state. A civilization was forming, and it required more than architecture. Narmer codified the bureaucracy. Governors, or nomarchs, were appointed to oversee each region, loyal to the throne, but rooted in their communities. Local customs were respected, even as they were folded into the wider kingdom. Justice was carried, not by sword, but by decree, passed down through layers of officials who bowed to a central principle: Marat, balance, order, truth. He was crafting not merely a kingdom, but a model. In the temples, priests kept calendars. They charted the stars and measured the flooding of the Nile. Agriculture became predictable, rhythmic. Harvests were stored in granaries, overseen by royal accountants. Famine was no longer a god's whim. It was something that could be prepared for, anticipated, less feared. In the palace, the artisans flourished. Jewelers set lapis in gold. Sculptors shaped diorite into divine forms. Potters traced the silhouette of the lotus and the falcon onto vessels. Beauty was no longer a luxury. It was a form of communication, a signal that the land was whole, that the gods were present, that the people had purpose. Even death began to follow a script. Tombs for nobility now echoed Narmer's own, multi-chambered, carefully aligned, painted with scenes of offerings, journeys, and judgment. The first iterations of what would one day become the great tombs of Giza. It was still humble, but the shape was there. A whisper of forever, carved into mud brick and red. He saw all this, the temples, the scrolls, the walls etched with his deeds, and understood that legacy did not need his voice to carry it forward. It would walk without him, and yet, in private, he still wrestled with silence. There were nights when he sat alone in the temple courtyard, the scent of myrrh heavy in the air. A single torch flickered in the breeze. He would stare at the columns, tall, smooth, painted with his name, and feel both comforted and distant from them. Was it enough? He had unified the lands. Yes, he had built the frame, but he knew the future would stretch beyond him, pulled by kings not yet born. Some wise, some foolish, some who would expand his vision, others who would fracture it. His name would survive, but his intentions might not. That was the burden of the founder, not to rule forever, but to build something strong enough that it could survive the ones who came after. And so, he returned again to the earth. He walked among the canal builders, sleeves rolled high, asking about clay, depth, and slope. He listened to farmers debate irrigation routes. He watched a young priest recite the liturgy of the sun and nodded in approval. This, not the crown, not the title, but this was what endured. He had made Egypt speak in one voice. Now he was teaching it how to listen, and far away, in the mountains of Nubia, a caravan arrived, bearing incense, cattle, gold, and something else, a carving in stone. It showed Narmer seated beneath the twin crowns, receiving tribute from lands beyond the known world. He touched it, once, briefly, then turned away, not because it wasn't true, but because he was already building something more lasting than stone. The crown, in its fullness, was never light. Narmer had worn it for decades, first as a warrior, then as a statesman, then as a father to a kingdom. The double crown, with its coils and crests, was more than adornment. It was history pressed. Against his brow, two lands, two peoples, one fragile hope. And now, as his back stiffened with age, and his hands bore the fine tremble of winter, Narmer felt its weight more deeply than ever. His hair, once dark, had thinned. His stride, once purposeful, was slower now. Yet his presence still filled the halls of Memphis like incense, not overpowering, but everywhere. When he entered a chamber, conversation fell still, not from fear, but reverence. The younger governors, sons of men he had once conquered, bowed more deeply than their fathers had. He did not smile often, but when he did, it was like the Nile in spring, quiet and utterly transforming. He spoke less. To Dot, in his final years of rule, Narmer learned the power of pause. A long silence from him could unsettle an entire room. His advisors had grown adept at reading his thoughts through the angle of his shoulder, the flicker of an eyelid. His will no longer needed shouting, but he did still speak with his son. The boy, now nearly a man, bore a different kind of fire. He was curious, articulate, and beloved by the court. But Narmer knew well, affection and loyalty are not the same. And so he tested him, gave him grain disputes to settle, sent him to the border provinces, tasked him with mediating between rival Priesthoods. The son learned, sometimes quickly, sometimes painfully. Narmer offered neither praise nor punishment easily. What he gave was clarity, the clear-eyed mirror of kingship, in which illusion dies and duty remains. On the western edge of Memphis, near the embankment where trade barges moored, he had a new hall built, not for worship nor judgment, but for records. Stone tablets, ivory tags, and the first great scrolls of reed paper were housed here, arranged under the watchful eyes of scribes trained from childhood. It was the kingdom's memory, and on its walls, in quiet relief, Narmer had carved a scene, not of war, but of weighing. On one side of a great balance, the white crown, on the other, the red. faceless, arms outstretched, not lifting, not choosing, simply holding them both. Balance that had always been the work in the far provinces. Temples now taught both mythologies, southern and northern, as parts of the same story. Festivals honored both crocodile gods and falcon gods, as if they had always walked side by side. Children sang the hymns of unity with no memory of fracture. What once was strategy had become faith, but Narmer, in his quietest moments, never forgot. He remembered the blood, the betrayals, the pain of building something from conflict, and he carried those memories like flint in a pouch, not to brandish, but to remind. On one summer day, when the Nile was full and the palms bowed with heat, Narmer stood before the temple in Hierakonpolis. He had returned, one last time, to the place of his youth. The cliffs still watched him with their ancient, patient eyes. The river murmured below, unchanged in its rhythm. He closed his eyes and listened to the rustle of acacia, the laughter of a boy chasing a hoop, the creak of boat timbers shifting in the sun, and then nothing. A quiet so completed. Hummed. He did not speak to the gods that day. He did not ask for signs. He had already received them in every harvest, every marketplace, every name, etched into clay by a scribe who did not know what Egypt had once been. His work was nearing its end, but not his legacy. The double crown would pass soon, not just to his son, but to time itself. A symbol worn by dynasties yet unborn, by rulers who would forget his name even as they repeated his rituals. And that Narmer understood was the final duty of the founder, to be forgotten as a man, but remembered in the shape of the world he made. The final flood came quietly. No heralds, no omens etched into stars. Just the usual rise of the Nile, slow, broad, patient, brushing the banks of Memphis with the same rhythm that had cradled Narmer's life since the beginning. He watched it from the terrace, wrapped in linen, flanked by silent guards. He stood as the river crept across the fields. Farmers shouted to one another in the distance. Children splashed in ditches that would soon overflow. Life unchanged, eternal. And yet for Narmer, everything felt suspended, like the moment between inhaling and exhaling, stretched impossibly. Long he was not dying, not yet, but his body knew something. His bones moved slower. His dreams lingered longer, and the voices around him, once loud, urgent, now sounded distant, as if already part of memory. He spent those final weeks not in retreat, but in return. He rode once more through the canals of Pharaoh, past lotus fields and the slow-turning wheels of village wells. He visited the temple of Seshat and watched the scribes at work, smiling faintly as a boy misspelled a royal name. He paused before old battlefields that now lay hidden beneath grain and wild barley. In each place he left nothing, no speeches, no farewell. He simply looked, and the land, as it had always done, looked back in Memphis. Preparations began. Priests spoke in hushed tones. Artisans reinforced the tomb walls at Abydos. The high steward of the palace drafted succession protocols. But Narmer gave no orders. He had already done what needed doing. Now he focused only on being present, one breath at a time. His son sat with him often. They played Sinot beneath the shade of a sycamore, moving pieces of ivory and jet across the worn board. The boy asked no questions about rulership. and Narmer gave no answers. They spoke instead of the river, of falcons and fish, of old songs their ancestors used to sing. It was not instruction, it was inheritance. On the last evening of his public life, Narmer walked to the edge of the palace compound, alone. The stars shimmered above, the same stars his priests had charted, the same stars he had aligned his tomb toward. He knelt and touched the ground. It was warm, soft from the flood, and he pressed his hand flat against it, not in desperation, but in gratitude, because he knew his name would not be shouted through eternity. It would be whispered by reeds swaying in the delta, by grain rustling in Theban wind, by stone walls still standing long after his bones had turned to dust. He would become part of the rhythm, a season, a breath, a beginning. When he returned inside, the court gathered in silence. No speeches, no ceremony, just bowed heads and a man stepping down from the dais. No longer a king, just a father, a builder, a man returning home. That night, in the sanctuary of his chambers, he lay beside the window and watched the moon ripple in the Nile dot. And as the city around him drifted into sleep, so did Narmer, not into death, but into forever. The sun rose the next morning, just as it always had, pale gold, stretching across the Nile like a benediction. Birds stirred in the papyrus reeds, temple bells chimed in Memphis. Fishermen hauled their nets from the cool shallows. The kingdom breathed, and yet something had shifted. The word spread not as thunder, but as mist. Narmer is gone. There was no wailing, no crashing of gongs or tearing of garments. The man who had forged a nation had left it as he had built it, with stillness, precision, grace. The priests in Memphis anointed his body in silence, washing it in scented oils drawn from the southern lands. They dressed him not in gold, but in linen. No excess, no spectacle, just a single falcon feather laid upon his chest, a mark of Horus, of watchfulness, of return. Caravans departed for Abydos under the veil of dawn. They did not march, they moved, like the river, steady, unbroken. Scribes walked beside warriors, farmers beside judges, children among elders. They carried baskets of figs, scrolls, ceramic flasks of wine, and tools, all gifts, not for a king, but for the continuation of what he had begun. And in the necropolis, the tomb stood ready. There were no towering pyramids yet, just earth, and stone shaped by memory. Ivory tags hung in niches, clay jars lined the walls. No statues, no portraits, just symbols, two crowns, a reed and a bee, a falcon in flight, the grammar of a legacy. The tomb was sealed not with sorrow, but with breath held in reverence, as if the very act of closing that door was too sacred to speak over, and still, Egypt did not falter. The new king, Narmer's son, took the double crown not with triumph, but with composure. He walked through the palace as his father had touched the same walls, spoke the same blessings. But the kingdom he inherited was no longer a fragile dream. It was formed, structured, lived, in, and he faded, as all founders must, into symbol. His name was invoked in prayers of protection. His deeds were sung in temple hymns. Young scribes copied the story of the great ballad, the image of a ruler taming chaos, holding balance, giving shape to the unshaped. They did not always know his face. but they knew the frame he had given them to live within in time. Myth would gather around him like mist over water. Some said he wrestled crocodiles in the marshes of the north. Others claimed he had spoken directly with Horus on the cliffs of Narration. A tale arose that he had been carried off, not by death, but by the Nile itself, chosen to become part of its eternal flow, guiding Egypt from beneath its waters forever. Truth gave way to reverence. Reverence gave way to legend. And yet, the temples still aligned with the stars. The fields still yielded to the calendar he had shaped. The names of the gods still shared shrines that once stood divided. The legacy was not in what was told, but in what endured. Generations passed, dynasties rose and fell. Civil wars flared like sparks, only to die in the shadow of his structure. And still, Narmer's fingerprints remained in the seal of a governor, in the ink of a scribe's hand, in the unspoken understanding that Egypt was one. He was not seen again, but he had never left. For in every border that held, in every crown that passed, in every reed that danced against the Nile's current, there was Narmer, still shaping, still watching, still beginning. Centuries rolled forward like sand across the steppe. The names of kings grew long and layered, Jordan, Kosekimwe, and later those who would raise pyramids into the sky, carve temples into cliffs, and chisel their victories onto granite. Each left their mark, each built higher, each reached further, but always at the root of it all. There was Narmer. His name appeared in ivory fragments, in seal impressions, in ink faded by centuries of sun. Not grandiose, not proclaimed, but steady, enduring, on the threshold between prehistory and history. There he stood, the one who bridged the two, long after his tomb had become part of the landscape, a gentle mound beneath the desert moon. His palette was unearthed, broken, weathered, but unmistakable. Two crowns. A mace, a falcon looming over a vanquished foe. It did not show a man. It showed a statement, a new reality, the birth of a kingdom from the dust of tribes. Historians debated its meaning. Was it symbolic, literal? Was Narmer truly new? The first king named by Manetto in a lineage of divine rulers. But the stone did not answer. It only revealed what mattered. There had been a beginning, and someone had made it real. In modern museums, behind glass, the palette rests now beneath soft lights and quiet awe. Visitors pass by, some intrigued, others unaware of the magnitude of what they see. Children point at the animals, scholars sketch the glyphs, tour guides mention the phrase First Dynasty, and the story moves on. But the stone waits, the story lingers, for Narmer was never only a man, he was the threshold. Before him, chaos, fragmentation, memory without record. After him, continuity, kingship, a nation that would stand for over 3,000 years. Others would eclipse him in grandeur, build higher, rule longer, but none could claim what he had. The first step into the idea of Egypt, and in that step, he became more than his time. He became time itself, not in legend, not in marble, but in the structure of how people lived, how they worshipped, how they remembered. Even in the modern world, far from red boats and falcon banners, echoes of his choice remain, in the idea that nations can be shaped, that difference can be stitched into unity, that vision, when bound to will, can outlive the man who dreamt it. Narmer did not ask to be a god, but he became one, not by thunder or miracle, but by craft. His temple was the nation, his monument, the daily life of a people, his crown, a question answered by action. Can to become one? Yes, and because of that answer, a civilization rose. The Nile still flows, and beneath its surface, quiet and enduring, so too does the memory of the man who first walked its length with the burden and gift of creation. Before gods wore crowns, before pyramids kissed the sky, before names were etched in stone, there was a man who imagined something that did not yet exist. Not immortality, not empire, but order. Narmer did not stand atop the world. He stood at its edge, between flood and fire, between memory and myth. He did not conquer to be remembered. He remembered so we might begin to understand what conquest was for. He gave shape to silence, balance to contradiction, a thread to history where none had been sown. He did not leave behind temples that scraped the heavens. He left something quieter, a system, a rhythm, a pulse that still beats beneath every story Egypt would ever tell. His crown was not made of gold. It was made of questions, held steady, worn well. We may never know his face, but we know what he gave us. The idea that from many there could be one. That from chaos, a people could find direction, and that even at the dawn of time, one man, walking with care, could leave footprints we still follow. And so the Nile flows, as it always has, carrying with it, quietly, the first dream of forever.